From the beginning of humankind, practitioners have been seeking knowledge on their individual paths. Those paths climb the highest peaks, the lowest valleys, through the mud bogs and swamps, through the warm meadow plains, pouring rains, and beyond, on a never-ending quest for knowledge. When those seekers find themselves lost in the woods, sometimes they'll find the Crone or the warlock in the back of them. The elders, the wise ones, the teachers. So, park your ride, pour a cuppa, set for a spell. You found your way to the Crone's Cauldron. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Glad to see you in the chat room. Onyx, glad to see y'all made it. Good evening, Mrs. Brown. For those of you who are listening on a later podcast, really, you gotta try and make it into our chat room on a Monday night at 9 Eastern. This evening's lesson is actually based on divination and symbolism. Divination is something that has gone back from the beginning pretty much of humankind. Now, those two things have been used throughout the history of magic across all of its many forms and pantheons from the very beginning. There are an equally vast majority of ways to do so that go along with that. I've seen thousands of pieces of source materials. They can be found in books, websites, various other study aids. I've even seen courses for pay that cover a huge array of what's actually available. So please, don't think the ones I mentioned now are the only ones to use. As I've said before, use what's comfortable for you, something you're drawn to. If you don't have something like that already, perhaps you might find something worth looking into in deeper detail here. As always, you're welcome to ask questions. I'm happy to answer them. You can do so in the chat room, or you can also contact me through the station website at www.sacredgroveradio.com. We would love to hear from you. Now, before we get into the meat of this, a bit of a disclaimer here, folks. I've been taught a vast array of divination skills, from the basic elemental to the esoteric and metaphysic levels. The ones I'm about to share with you are just a taste of what's out there and what you can tap into. Now, not everyone needs tools. We don't need tea leaves, cards, dice, pendulums, crystal ball. We don't need any kind of pricey accoutrement like that. It can be as simple as watching smoke from a stick of burning incense for signs and symbols, to watching the coals from a balefire to divine fortune of the coming season. It's as simple as gazing into a candle flame, or onto a pool of still water, and letting your mind show you an image. It can be as simple as just knowing. Now, a few important points to note when attempting any type of divination, however. One biggest key, the biggest key thing, is to accept what you see, what you hear, what you feel as being real and exactly as it is shown to you. Trust it. The instant you start putting expectations on what you're trying to interpret, you're going to skew that message, or you're going to miss it altogether. Now, I did this a lot when I first started, and I found my accuracy rate increased significantly when I learned to just accept what I was sensing. 2, it isn't going to be perfect. Like every skill, it's partly learned, partly something you may already know from deep within. But as always, you must always practice, practice, practice. Keep in mind, the master has failed more times than the student has tried. 3, it's extremely helpful to have your journal and pen handy. You'll find it important to write down what it is you're sensing. You're going to need to refer to it later, either for the message or even just for checking your own accuracy. Likely both. I still do this, and I've been doing this for over 30 years. 4, when keeping notes, always make a note of the date, time, and day of the week. If you're curious enough, especially if you're susceptible to lunar pull, note the lunar phase as well. You're going to find over time what effect those things have on your skills. For a vast majority of practitioners of all sorts, and it doesn't seem to matter who it is or what they practice, the days of the week, the time of day, can be important clues to your personal power hours. Now, these are certain points of the day, week, month, or year in which your personal skills are stronger than others. And this affects how easily you can connect to the energies that you're going to need to tap into to do some of this. Now, this information also connects to the power times of deities that may be working with you. Okay, disclaimer, I realize you may choose not to work with deities in particular. That doesn't mean they're not aiding you. As I've mentioned on past shows, there's the patronage of deities. Each of us have had past lives, and if we've worked with them in the past and they like us, that comes with us when we're born into this one and everything that entails. Okay? 5. We must always be mindful that the divination messages are not generated by ourselves. They come from on high, so to speak, meaning that this is something that should be approached with respect and humility. If the messages aren't forthcoming, you may be in a state of either flux or chaos, and whatever the vision, the knowing, or message you receive, or even if you don't get any at all, and that happens, this should be treated with respect, and thanks should always be given, whatever the case. And that, ladies and gents, can be as simple as offering a heartfelt thank you to whatever energies are around you, as those are the ones you're actually receiving the messages from. And 6, as always, you're not always going to get the answers you want or maybe looking for. I have done more than one reading for people where the questions they've wanted answers are not what the cards or the crystals would tell me. Divination can be both a gift and a curse. It's all in how you view it. And as with most magical subjects, I have a number of books that are in my personal library. And the ones that I grab, I reach for the most. Some of them, and you'll understand why, have been in my collection for quite some time, and some have been passed down. And again, use what you're drawn to, go what you're drawn to. Not everything that's covered in these books may interest you. If not, find something that does. Research. Always, always, always look. But my particular favorites are the following. Zolaris Encyclopedia of Ancient and Forbidden Knowledge. And sadly, this one went out of print quite some time back, and I don't know if it's ever been republished. This book covers a wide array of subjects from Kabbalistic numerology, casting astrological charts, horoscopic information. It's got other chapters that cover things such as the astral world, the dark orb, and various other esoteric and metaphysic information. Speaking of numerology, math never really was a strong suit for me, so I picked up a copy of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Numerology. Great place to start. It's a comprehensive primer. There are a number of ways to use this technique, and they actually have a pretty reasonably good accuracy rate. For definitions and ideas for divination techniques, because eventually, you get bored, you want to try something new, I use Eva Shaw's Divining the Future, Prognostication from Astrology to Zoomacy. It has all sorts of technical names for a vast array of types of techniques. It isn't my only go-to, but I do find it a handy reference. Another handy guide I've had passed down to me is Fate and Fortune by Brian Innes, Francis King, and Neil Powell. This particular book covers four topics in particular: the I Ching, palmistry, basic Gregorian horoscopes, and the tarot. It does actually touch briefly on the alchemic tarot in conjunction with astrology. And this one was actually one of my springboard books. By far, however, hands down, my absolute favorite, without a doubt, is Divining the Future by Sally Morningstar. It's a comprehensive book that covers the Elder Futhark runes, including how to properly make your own, palmistry, tarot, shamanic practices, including Near and Far East Asiatic techniques, in addition to the more familiar Western and European shamanic practices. This particular section even gets into soul retrieval. There's also an excellent section on dream interpretation and dream work, which I'll get into a little more later. It has a wonderful guide to Gregorian horoscopes and the Chinese as well, including their ruling elements. Now, the Chinese is very different from the type of horoscope we're likely all familiar with. It does, however, cover only the far Asian Chinese horoscopes. There's another that is found in places like Vietnam, Cambodia, and other nearby archipelagos. It's slightly different. There's a number of variations. And last but not least, and you'll hear me talk about this again, it includes a really well-detailed section on the I Ching as well. Again, only a taste of what's out there. These are ones I learned from and worked with. You're encouraged to look around for what calls to you. With that in mind, here's a few of the methods of divination that I've used over the years. Many of these came naturally. However, control of them, in addition to proper communication skills and precautions, had to be learned. Communication with what, you may ask? Well, as you'll see, you can connect to anything and divine from anywhere. Now, speaking of the best time and place to use divination techniques, that varies depending on the practitioners and their practice. When we're first starting out, it's usually in a calm, quiet place away from distractions. However, there are those who can work under a maelstrom of other energy movements and distractions. It's up to the person doing the divination. Now, some of these methods go back to ancient times and are used still today to a fairly accurate degree, depending on the source of information and comprehensiveness of source materials that you use to learn from. I found I could practice any time of day with most of the methods I'm about to list off for you now. This includes the officially recognized names, and oddly enough, the vast basis of these names are Latin in terminology. Many are in origin as well. I find it rather ironic. The language of the original persecutors of people who could do some of these things is now used to categorize those skills. Well, with that being said, now let's get into some of the fun stuff. The very first recorded means of divination is pyromancy or pyroscopy, dividing by fire through the observation of flames. Either a sacrificial fire, a candle, lantern, flame, any source of flame will do. This uses the behaviors and colors of the flames themselves as to the interpretation. This practice is what gave rise to the term devil's fire. That's actually the blue-white flame that you can sometimes witness in a campfire, fireplace, or any other natural source of flame. If it appeared in a divination fire, it was said to bring trouble and misfortune for those whom the divination was made. Now, notably, this particular method requires unrefined fuel such as wood or wax candles as a basis. And another interesting tidbit, this can include the magical properties of the wood and other burnable materials that you start with to build the fire that you wish to gaze into for this particular technique. That's if you want to go into it that far. Another example of this, if you've ever studied any sort of Judeo-Christian teaching, you're likely to have heard of the burning bush. Well, that biblical story actually falls into this category too, and also involved the skill of clairaudience as well. After all, there was a voice heard coming from the flames. Now, I'm pretty sure most of us are familiar with, at least in passing, with astrology. This practice uses celestial bodies and their interactions to predict events and life paths. This coincides with another divinatory practice, horoscopy, or as we commonly know it, the horoscopes. Many of us look at our birth signs in the horoscope section of a local newspaper, magazine, and did you know that those can actually be cast in a variety of ways? You don't actually have to use an astrological chart. I used to write a monthly horoscope for a local magazine, and I used cartomancy to do so. You'll likely recognize that as card reading. This practice has a rich history. If you want a good look at that, check the Files tab on the Crone Cauldron's page on Facebook. There's a file that actually gives the history of the playing card deck that we all know, which descended from the tarot. The basis of the tarot actually goes back so much further than Western Europe in the Common Era centuries. It can actually be traced from ancient China through the Silk Road to ancient Egypt and beyond. That particular lesson also gives a basic how-to on using a modern-day ordinary playing deck. to read. Everything is covered along with a basic layout and interpretation guide. Now, the very first divination technique that I learned that actually required a casting tool was to learn astraglomancy, or divination by casting dice. The oldest known dice date back to roughly 3000 before Common Era, so about 5,000 years ago, and originated in the area that is now known as Iran. As it was something that didn't really feel right for me, I never did do much with it. Not everything we're going to try is going to work for us, and sometimes that's usually because it's not meant to. Another technique you may recognize is tasseomancy, or tasseography, commonly referred to as a tea leaf reading. This is done by using loose tea in a teapot. Give it a stir before you pour. You want a decent amount of leaves to enter the cup with the liquid. It takes a minute or two to settle in the bottom of the cup. Sip carefully and leave a small amount of liquid in the bottom. Swirl the cup to coat the sides of it with leaves and quickly turn it upside down onto the saucer. Let it sit for about 20, 30 seconds, just enough for the liquid to drain off. Turn it back upright. Now, if you've done it properly, the herbs and the leaves from the brew will leave patterns in the cup. These can form symbols, including letters of the alphabet or numbers, and it's these patterns that are interpreted. And this can be anything. If they work with tools, for instance, you might see a hammer, you might see a pair of pliers or a ladder. Symbols, when you're doing this sort of divination, isn't fixed, or what we call fixed, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. Now, with this, many kinds of tea can be used, and some practitioners prefer to blend their own herbs so that they can harness the magic of those herbs, flowers, and plant parts. It wasn't uncommon for a special tea to be made to heal or to aid towards another end, such as spelling for a marriage or pregnancy, and the resulting patterns in the cup were used to discern the specific answers being sought. Again, I got to express some caution with this one, folks. Not all flowers, plant parts, and herbs can be ingested. While things like white oleander or Dieffenbachia plants have incredibly powerful magical properties, if you ingest them, they'll kill you. There are many herbs that are harmful to pregnant women and the child or children she carries within. Before attempting to blend your own herbs, always, always, always do your homework thoroughly. You can readily access information on herbs, their uses, the do's and don'ts. There is absolutely no excuse, none, for risking your life or that of another, especially one yet to be born. Now that I've gotten off that soapbox, another ancient form of divination is the Chinese method of casting and interpreting the I Ching. Some diviners rely solely on the I Ching manual. That, in and of itself, is a form of bibliomancy. That's the practice of divination using random passages from books. Often, although not always, these are usually religious texts of various descriptions. That's not set in stone, however. I've come across many people who picked up the right book at the right time. I've done this myself. It's been a wide variety of things, from magazine articles I find in various waiting rooms to study books of all sorts. Even in high school, it wasn't unusual for me to just open books where it was required, or close to it, and all without flipping pages. This is often done at the first crack of the book. As I mentioned before, another commonly used method is numerology, which is the use of numbers and their vibrational meanings, as numbers actually have spiritual significance. That's why you'll rarely, if ever, see a 13th floor on a high-rise or other large-scale building, and why it's crucial to have a rudimentary understanding of the very basics, as it's actually used in weaving magical spells. Now, this is one of the first things that I was taught. I think I started learning it by the time I was about 9 or 10. This actually has many applications, and even if it's not something you use for divination, you really should have the basics. Different numbers mean different things, and they're used for different purposes, just like letters. They're what we call fixed symbols. And you got to remember, before I forget, another subheading of this subject is arithmancy. That's a conversion of alphabetic letters into numeric form. Kabbalistic numerology uses this frequently, so I actually didn't realize until I started doing some homework for this that it was separate unto itself. There are, like I said, several practices of this and interpretations of the meanings. it's a really, really old practice. And as we all know, what was old once is soon new again. Many practices have been revamped and reworked to be adapted for more modern uses. That also covers incorporation of one form into another form of practice. This also includes expanding on old practices with modern technology, science, and general knowledge. This growth of techniques and know-how grows and morphs just as society does. Now, another archaic form, and it's very unique, of divination is dowsing. Now, this is done either with metal or wooden rods, usually metal rods, or a Y-shaped stick of wood. Now, you might have seen this in some of the old Little House on the Prairie episodes or things like that. Yeah, it can be used to find wood, and they use the Y-shaped crook of a willow to do that. But however, this can be used to divine so much more. Placement of water is one, but ley lines, vortices, energy points, and even spirit energy. When divining for the last one, caution must be exercised, as you never know what you're walking into when you're dealing with non-corporeal sentient energies. Another of my favorites, palamancy, using a pendulum. This can be a very simple or complex means of divination. One has only to look online or in a witchy type shop to find oodles of various pendulums made from various stones and all sorts of types and sizes and styles, and each of them have their own property and uses. I've even found various metal ones over the years. I fell in love with a brass one that was hollow. The top could be unscrewed so a small item such as stone, hair, slip of paper, or a photograph could be inserted before use. Now, it was this sort of item I would use in conjunction with a map to find things, like my friend's car after it had been stolen. Eventually, the list of things I found myself divining for came to include the bodies of missing and murdered. This was often done at the request of either law enforcement officials or families and their loved ones. Another pendulum type and method that is really, really old is to use a single strand of freshly plucked hair from an expectant mother's head, along with a gold ring from her hand, to determine the gender of the child and if it would be healthy. Now, there's a vast selection of scrying methods. Now, this is used to seek a vision by gazing into a transparent, translucent, or otherwise reflective surface. This means you can use any one of a number of things. Surfaces such as windows, mirrors, bits of unwrinkled foil. I've even used a chrome bumper to see things. Oh, and here's another tidbit. Tuck this one away. It comes in the realm of elemental magic. And did you know you can even make a divination from casting down a handful of dirt and reading how it falls, or using natural rock formations? That is called geomancy. The most common type of scrying, though, has got to be crystal gazing. A stone globe is probably the most recognized tool of this craft. However, other types of stones, such as a seer stone, which is what I personally use, can be used with this technique. I've also used fire scrying. Now, this is done by concentrating on a flame, such as a campfire, candle, believe it or not, even a match head if you're that quick, and seeking a vision. I frequently use still water. That can actually be charged with crystals or coins of various metals. And the water scrying technique is one I often use in conjunction with the pendulum, and I have exceptionally favorable results with it. Some of the more traditional mediums for this are ink, smoke, wine, or as we all know from the Disney version of Snow White, a magic mirror. After all, where do you think the use of mirror, mirror on the wall came from? Another interesting little tidbit. Back before the toxic properties of mercury were known, 'twas not unusual to use a pool of this metal to scry with either. Mercury was called quicksilver because of its physical properties and was used to coat the backs of mirrors to give them their reflective properties. And this is actually where the 7 years bad luck for breaking a mirror comes from. It takes roughly 7 years for the effects of mercury to leave the body after exposure. This also gives antique mirrors an advantage when using this particular method, as it has a magical property of its own as well, and it's an ancient one. As with all of your divination tools, keep them clean, psychically as well as physically. They can become as grimy and gummed up with junk energy as we can. Our tools are nothing more than an aid for what we can already do. And with that in mind, we must show whatever tool we use respect. This includes ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, especially ourselves. Another well-used method, palmistry. Study of hands to divine things such as the number of children, marriages, lifetimes lived, and even the amount of psychic power you carry. Quite a number of years ago, I was at a psychic fair and there was somebody that caught my attention. Not in a bad way, but the energy piqued my curiosity. As it turned out, he read palms. The most intriguing thing to me at the time was his response when I dutifully proffered up my hands for the reading. He was somewhat startled and taken aback, although he covered it quickly and well. I was rather surprised when he proceeded to point out things he had no way of knowing, as I put up extremely intense shields even before going in the building. Towards the end of the reading, he traced out the Eye of Ra that's on my right hand and a deep pentagram on my left. Both of these symbols are in the very centers of the palm, right where the chakra and auric power points are. He explained what it meant at the time, but it didn't really sink in what it actually meant until much later. And this practice can be done with the feet as well, and that particular method is called podomancy. One practice I've made mention of before, both earlier tonight and on previous shows, zoomacy. Watching animals and their characteristics, behaviors, and appearances. Now, this can include things like watching them prepare for winter. It'll give you an idea of how long and cold the winter season is going to be. Now, this goes back to my last show, Signs and Omens. Those are things that are found in nature. Only zoomacy is specifically related to animals of all kinds, period. As I said before, not everything included in this list of methods is for everyone. Pardon. Some of these can be dangerous to your physical, mental, and spiritual health. So caution should be used when starting any sort of divinatory practice. Some of the ones I'm about to get into now are a little more esoteric in nature, and for some, it may come naturally, while others are going to struggle with these. And there are others who should not attempt some or any of these particular techniques at all for their own personal well-being. Disclaimer being said, this is my ballywick. This is most of the stuff that I work with on a day-to-day basis. This is the kind of stuff that you would expect from a quote-unquote psychic. One very, very basic divination skill, and you don't need any tools or anything like this. You just need you, an uncluttered, unclogged you. It's intuition, or just knowing. This includes predictive skills such as those exhibited by Helen Duncan. She was otherwise known as the Blitz Witch. Interesting historical footnote on her, she was actually the last woman to be tried in Britain under the Witchcraft Act. These laws were enacted in and throughout the Dark Ages and medieval times. But here's the kicker. She was tried in 1944. Her crime? She was able to tell the loved ones at home, in London, of the loss of individual men and the ships that they were serving on during the Second World War. She was so accurate, she knew which ships were lost before the governmental divisions of the Admiralty and the War Office did. Now, other intuitive psychics of note are people like Edgar Casey, Jean Dixon, and Sarah Winchester. Now, this particular skill has been used by a vast array of notable figures throughout history, actually. Chances are you've heard of Nostradamus, Zoroaster, or Paracelsus, or Periclesis, But did you know of Albertus Magnus from the 13th century? He actually expanded on Zoroaster's works. Now, note the century. This was post-Christianity's European introduction and forced entrenchment. Now, even Sir Francis Bacon, the Jesuit friar of historical fame, used it. You can easily find others who have been said to use this technique. One such notable figure is Joseph Smith, the originator of the Mormon movement. Now, this practice also extends to the leaders of its various offshoots and subcults as well. Sects of this particular branch of religious practice include sects such as the Order and the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, or FLDS as it's referred to in the news. Another person that used this method and gained quite a bit of notoriety is David Koresh of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. Let that sink in for a second, folks. These really can run away with you. They're not for the faint of heart, and they're not for the foolish. You can often, the practice of autography, and this is another one you really got to be careful with. This is automatic handwriting. Again, another old form of divination and one that's often used by channelers. And I'll get into that next week on next week's show, because I'm going to actually touch on more empathic skills than just divination. Now, autography, channeling, anything like that, this is done while in a conscious trance state. Now, an interesting note with this one, even the doodling we did as kids fall into this. Myself, I used to doodle the same hooded, red-eyed figure hundreds, even thousands of times all over my notebooks, textbooks, scraps of paper, whatever I could get my hands on. And I did this throughout my childhood and my teens. It was actually something that haunted me from my dreams. A face that still recurs even now. It pops up from time to time if I'm, not kind of paying attention. But it's gotten a lot less since I shed the demonic attachment I had. And again, this method and some of the following ones come with a warning. What you tap into will not, and I repeat, will not have your interests at heart. Careful considerations and precautions must be taken when doing this, because when using these techniques, you're in an open state. And if you're not careful, the energy beings around you that you tap into can jump you. In other words, they take complete possession of you, your body, everything. Now, this is potentially extremely dangerous and can be incredibly problematic in the future, even long after the entity or being is expelled, if it ever is. And trust me, I should know. I've had a few of these cases come across my desk over the years. Another means is using an oracle. Now, this means making contact with deities or other spirits that are summoned for a consultation. This can be done in many ways, through ritualistic worship, shamanic practice, various oracle tools such as a Ouija board or oracle tarot deck. The connection the oracle makes is to a summoned being. The energy that comes through when doing this is most often channeled through the oracle itself and will give its message in that fashion. Now, there are human oracles. They didn't disappear with the practices of Delphi, folks. They're alive and well. They walk among us, even today. An important side note, this is not the same as sciomancy or divination by using a spirit guide. The biggest difference being that the spirit guide is not summoned. This particular method is done most often with your personal spirit guide or guides. You can, and often do, have more than one. They're not summoned. They're always with you, whether you hear them, see them, feel them, or not. Eventually, if you work at it, you can actually connect to them. And, it's like having your best friend in your head, if you get the right one. And the guy I had the longest, he was great at finding sales, funky items for my wardrobes, all kinds of witchy stuff for cheap or free. Great at finding lost items and forgotten things, too. He had a knack for keeping me on schedule and on track when I was scattered or overwhelmed. And when you can connect to them properly, they're invaluable on a magical life path, no matter what you choose to practice. Another very, very old divination practice is the use of runes. Again, this method uses fixed symbols. They were originally an alphabet and were also used as sigils and or symbols. Now, keep in mind, this is one method I've never really used or have been drawn to, personally. However, a large number of my students, my contemporaries and colleagues, do use them regularly. What I know of them, I've learned through research, not use. However, the Reverend uses them. He's been kind enough to draw for me when I've needed some guidance on my path. And what I've come to know about them over, all the research and the years that I've heard about them and seen them, is as follows. First and foremost, they're a personal guide. While you can draw for others, it is done with the rune set's permission beforehand. These are as personal as a shamanic medicine bag, some tarot decks, or the connection with your spirit guides or deities. As it is such an extremely personal method, it's recommended you make your own. That way you have the closest connection with them. There's a well-photographed how-to in the book I mentioned earlier, Divining the Future by Sally Morningstar on runes. The section found in that particular book covers everything, from choosing the type of rune you want, its proper harvest, collection of whatever you feel drawn to use, be it wood, clay, or stone. It covers important basics, such as connecting to, using, and caring for them. It also includes a well-worded section on their meaning, as well as how to do some basic rune layouts. And the set that's actually featured in that particular book is one of the oldest and most commonly used sets, and it's called the Elder Futhark. Now, it does have a number of descendant sets and at least one sister set as well, the differences of which seem to be in the beginning origins and use in various places throughout their history by different groups of people. One set even has symbols that are not used alphabetically, but are used strictly as cycles or symbols for magic and healing. And the differences I found between the various types of rune sets are these. The Elder Futhark is a set consisting of 25 runic symbols. Now, this includes a blank one. They're Norse and Germanic in origin. The world timeline during which these were developed and widely used is known as the Teutonic period. Now, their particular origins date back as far as the 11th century in a number of cases. The younger Futhark consists of the Danish, Swedish, and Norse runic alphabet and symbologies. There are the Anglo-Saxon Frisian runes. This set consists of the Elder Futhark plus 5 more. Related to that one is the Northumbrian set. This consists of the Anglo-Saxon Frisian I just mentioned, plus another 4 more. Now, if you know your European history, you can trace their path through early Europe and see for yourself how the descendant sets came to be. As we should all be aware, belief systems and divination methods morph and change as humanity has traveled the globe. They're inextricably tied together. Where our magic comes from now is the same as it was then. It's simply interpreted differently in a lot of cases, or in some others, the practices have stood the test of time. Now, as I previously mentioned, runes were originally used as an alphabet. However, the medieval runes were not used for writing, but are instead, these are the ones that are used only strictly for magic and healing purposes. There's also the Armenan runes. Now, these are Scandinavian in origin. However, they were created by Guido List, who lived from 1848 until 1919. So this is a newer adaptation. The one set out of all of these that got my attention and actually piqued my own curiosity are the Gothic runes. Their current interpretation is based on the knowledge of the Elder Futhark, although there is no rune poem as to their meaning that's been passed down or archaeologically discovered. That means their original true meaning has been lost to time. And in addition to that intriguing little mystery, this particular runic set is only found on one type of stone, the Cauldron stone. It's the oldest known runic stone, and its use dates back to 400 CE. So 0400, about 1600 years ago. Now, runes are a great example of what is known as fixed symbology. Things such as numbers, the alphabet we all use fall into this category. Other examples of this are the planetary and horoscopic symbols you find in astrological charts, the pictographic elemental symbols used in the practice of alchemy. Among other things that come under this heading are symbols such as the pentagram, the cross, the tetragrammatron, any type of mandala, and voodoo bebes. to name but a few. The opposite of this is something called transmutable symbology. Now, you'll find this throughout shamanic practices. Another place you'll find it is elemental gazing or scrying. As with any divinatory practice, this is entirely personal to the person seeking the vision and for them to interpret. While other people and sources of information can guide you in the interpretation of the vision or knowing you receive, ultimately, it's what it means to you, the diviner, that matters. Take, for instance, the practice of aneromancy. It's a practice that dates back as far as the ancient Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. We know this today as dream interpretations, and that is an essential part of dream work for those who are so inclined, or unlike myself, able. Personally, I have at least 4 books dedicated to the subject I use regularly. Each one is very comprehensive in and of itself. However, not every book or source material is going to have everything in it. Sometimes a dream symbol is in only 1 or 2 of the dozens of books or source materials you can look through for help with the interpretation. I found myself, both for myself and as well as my students and some of my clients, the symbol I'm seeking to interpret can be found in many places. But out of all of them, only one will have an interpretation that will ring true as being pertinent. And sometimes the interpreted meaning isn't always the same, although often there are similarities in the interpretations. Other things such as colors, numbers, and people that appear all have meaning as well. Now, keep in mind not all people dream the same way either. Again, this is a very personal type of divination, and we're all uniquely individual when it comes to using this sort of technique. There are herbs that you can use to aid you in creating dreams and dream visions. Things such as mugwort, lemongrass, or wormwood, or other incense blends, can be used before bed to aid your dreaming. Never, ever, 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 ever go to bed with incense or candles lit. This poses a huge fire hazard and a great risk to your health and safety. As with any herb work, do the research, know how to use it properly, and not all herbs can be used in the same way. Some are toxic and can be lethal if used improperly. That being said, valerian is used to aid remembering your dreams as well as a general sleeping aid. On a contrary note, for those who have PTSD or other medical ailments and are using a cannabis treatment regime, that particular herb has been noted for its repression of dreams. You'll dream, but often will not remember them. And I actually know this is true. I'm a medical cannabis user myself. And also a big reason why I keep a dream journal and a pen on my nightstand. Everybody should. Because these things will fade. The details can fade very quickly upon waking, even if you don't use cannabis therapy. These can disappear very, very quickly. It's always important to note them down. Even, grab it on your way to the bathroom while you're sitting there doing your morning ritual. Make note of this stuff so you can come back and check it later if you don't have time to look it up on your way to the office. There's a vast, it's rare, and personally, before I go any further, it's personally rare that I actually do dream. I do, however, get messages in the state between asleep and awake. Now, I first discovered what I later came to learn as the gray zone of consciousness. One morning, I could actually feel myself surfacing from a dark gray light towards a brighter one, and my conscious mind actually functioned enough at this point to think, I'm waking up, right before I opened my eyes. I woke up fully awake, aware, with all of my faculties intact. I think it was like 14 or 15 at the time. That gray zone of consciousness is usually what we're supposed to be trying to hit when we meditate. I find this is where my messages come through the clearest and the strongest. This is where I get the most clear visions. I don't have to use the movie screen inside my head. My eyes actually show me. I guess they use my eyelids for a screen instead. I don't know. But either way, that's how it works for me. There's a vast amount of work that can be done through dreams. Astral connections, many other things can be accomplished this way. It's also in a dream world that we open up to other levels of being and levels of existence. This is why, if you follow some of the sorts of things I do, you'll see that ghostly beings and other entities will often come while the victim is asleep and appear in their dreams. We also see this with visitations from ancestors or other spirits that are trying to make contact. It's because they have an easier time getting through to you. Your conscious mind is turned off. The part of you that says, no, you can't be real, ain't there. Now, as I mentioned on a prior show, I was actually in a dream world when I finally shed my demonic attachment. That was when I was sucked out of hell by my shirt collar, and my astral self was slammed into my body and promptly made me puke up my toenails. Another method of divination that is far, far more recent in origin. Things like technomancy have risen in recent decades. Yeah, my very first introduction to this was entirely by accident when I think I was like 13, 14. I was watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries with my mom, and all of a sudden it felt like my brain got sucked out of my head and into the TV. There were various colored lights flashing by, and to me at the time it looked like the inside of a fiber optic cable. You know, kind of like you'd expect to see in the movies. You know, like Crone comes to mind. Well, in hindsight, that's probably exactly what it was. Well, the next thing I could remember, I got spat out into a metal foundry and saw the man who was being featured during that particular show segment. He was listed as a missing person at that time of the broadcast. His killer was later let go for lack of physical evidence, even though the circumstantial case should have put the guy away. Well, I watched as the murder was committed, as well as seeing the body sinking and dissolving into a vat of what had to have been some sort of molten metal. I could smell the burning flesh, the molten steel. I could hear his blood-curdling screams. It was as clear as if I was standing right there. I got a good look at the murderer, too, and just as quickly snapped back into my body. My mom witnessed this happening, and as she knew full well by this time what sorts of skills I already had, she just waited and watched. According to her time estimation, it took less than a minute for the entire thing to happen. Hops. During which my eyes snapped wide open at first, darted around frenetically for about 20-25 seconds, settled down, and closed partially as if I was watching something very intently for a few more seconds, and jolted back to my usual self and was looking around rather startled. I'm sure you can understand why. Well, I've since learned to use this skill in a lot of other ways, and for a lot of other purposes, as it has a multitude of uses. Another sort of divination skill is psychometry. This is the ability to read information from a tangible object, a place, or even just, a photograph. This can be both a blessing and a curse. This also falls into something I'll be getting into again next week, empathic skills. There's a vast array of them out there. I hope I'll be able to give you an idea of where to start looking for your own special skills so that you can build on those and gain more knowledge to help you on your own path. With psychometry, incredibly useful when choosing which things to purchase. This can include everything from your food to your house and car. Handy when garage selling and antiquing, too. It's especially helpful when choosing which divination or witchcraft tools are meant for you as well. We all encounter pretty things we may like, but they're not all meant for us. And when we choose to use those sorts of particular tools, in some cases, like pendulums, they may work with you, although often it'll be grudgingly, and some won't work at all. I've seen that with tarot decks, rune sets, scrying mirrors, and or dowsing rods. Yes, all four of those have just said, no, I'm not for you. I've tried them. Incidentally, found homes for them, and they work great for everybody else but me. I never could get the hang of using the rods, but then again, I have other methods at my disposal that do work well for me, so I can use those instead. As the old saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Now, speaking of which, on a more gruesome note, there's a few other methods of divination I do not use, but have come across in my studies over the years. Things like haruspex, or reading the entrails of an animal. This is seen even today in Santorini and voodoo practices, as well as African and Middle Eastern tribal practices. Anthropomancy, is the method of using human entrails for this skill in particular. Now, this sort of thing also gives rise to the practice of reading blood droplets. For those who may be interested in this, I am not going to discourage its use or practice, but I have to give a serious warning to anyone who decides to dabble in or study blood magic. It is one that is often used by very dark practitioners. It's incredibly powerful and so incredibly dangerous if used improperly. Now, don't get me wrong. Blood magic has its place. I've used it for many things. However, that's only because I've studied the practice long before I ever used it, and I only ever use it towards a lighter goal. For instance, menstrual blood can actually be used as a bait for an incubus, so you can trap him in a vessel for removal. Blood drops from a specific individual can be used in spell work for a more powerful effect or a clearer targeting. Now, that is incredibly helpful when trying to get rid of a maniacal stalker who will not leave you alone and have him gone once and for all. One last interesting practice that is still used by a number of tribal practices from across the globe, and it's even used in today's westernized society in a more prosaic way than that, scotomacy, the practice of using animal or human excrement to divine answers from. There are written records of this actually being used in medieval times, most notably by the royal physicians. And if you think about it, it's still used in the medical profession even today. Ew. Yeah. Ah, gross. I hope you've all learned something and you've had your interests or curiosities piqued. Something to keep foremost in mind about every technique and method I've listed off here. These all have one thing in common. You. Divination isn't a skill that everyone will have. As I like to tell people, I'm psychic when necessary, but not necessarily psychics. These sorts of skills cannot be turned off easily. Once you've got them, you have to practice them. You have to work with them. When you've practiced enough, it becomes as automatic as breathing. Now, that may sound like a good idea, and it is. But then again, there's a balance to be kept and a price to be paid for being able to do the things I've mentioned. And ever so many more skills, which, again, I'll be getting into next week, because we all have at least one empathic or psychic gift. If you're not sure what yours is, you may find it. If you have an idea of what your gift is, perhaps you'll be able to expand your knowledge further. Now, with all of that being said, like I said, you are the absolute best tool that you will ever have for any kind of divinatory work, any kind of magical working, any kind of charm, enchantment, spell, incantation, even just something as simple as making food or drink is something you can magically charge. You don't have to, light a red candle. You don't have to lay out, a circle. You don't have to do all of that stuff. It comes down to your personal will and your intent. How many times as kids, and I'm sure many of us will remember this, we were really sick and somebody in our family made us a pot of chicken soup. And what do you know? It worked. We felt better, or we got better. It's not just the ingredients that go into something like that, and that's food magic, and that's something I'll get into again later, because keep in mind, folks, my straight job, I was a chef. Your magic, your skills, that's what drives all of this. That's what powers all of this. This is what picks up all these energies. And with that in mind, ladies and gents, I hear the distinct sound of a teapot calling. It's just about time for my hour to be up. I'm going to leave some time and some room for some words from our sponsors. Again, if you haven't come to the site, you haven't checked them out, uh, Clarissa's page, oh, she has got some really neat stuff in there. I was just tinkering around. Twitch's Stitches. I cannot wait to get my hands on some extra cash and a credit card. I am so ordering stuff. And if people try and steal it, I'm just going to tell them to get their own. Or better yet, I'll buy them one too. Again, Raven Wings, her stuff is just, she's fabulous. Onyx Moon, as always, I love her stuff. I can't prop her enough. I've ordered from her myself. I've ordered from her and sent to clients. It's great. And I mean, I don't know where to start, folks. I could probably prop these guys for the next hour. And even though I know I could run over if I really wanted to, I'm going to behave myself this week. So, this week. I don't know about next week, but this week I'll behave. In the meantime, go with care, go with love, and we'll see you next time here at the Crone's Cauldron. Good night.